I ran the diagnostics for the 4th time that week, scanning through the data streams on the screen. Same results, same numbers. Outpost Mars 12 was operating at full efficiency, or at least it was supposed to be. For all the cutting-edge equipment we had out here, things never worked as smoothly as the people back on Earth thought. Dust, heat, strain on the circuits. It all wore down the systems faster than you'd expect. That's what kept me busy, though. The moment you get comfortable, something breaks, and then it's back to work. I wiped the sweat off my forehead, even though it was cold in here. Mars had that way of messing with you, bone dry and freezing one minute, sweltering the next. That constant layer of red dust didn't help either, always creeping in through the seals. It'd cling to your boots, your suit, your skin if you let it, making the place feel more like a graveyard than a mining outpost. The guys down in the lower shafts had hit a bit of a snag earlier. They weren't thrilled about it. The drill had hit something solid, something it shouldn't have. We'd been working in this sector for months, and according to every geological scan, there wasn't supposed to be anything but rock and ore down there. But when that drill buckled against the resistance, we thought we'd hit a metal deposit. Gold, maybe. Something to make this miserable shift worth it. I rubbed my eyes. Routine was supposed to keep the madness of isolation at bay. It worked, to a point. But when things broke, when the schedule changed even slightly, everyone got on edge. Even I could feel it, that slight tension creeping in. Isolation makes everything heavier. Every decision, every problem, even breathing felt like a chore after a while. The comms activated. It was Frank, the drill foreman. His voice, rough from too many years of sucking down air that was too thin, too dry. "Hey, Marlowe, you might want to come down to Shaft 4. We hit something odd." I sighed and clicked the comm back. "What now? Drill jammed?" "No, it's something metal. Not like the regular stuff." "What do you mean, not like the regular stuff? You find a crashed probe down there." I tried to make it sound like a joke, but there was something in his voice. Something that made me pause. Frank didn't get rattled easily. "Nah," he said after a beat. "Doesn't look like anything I've ever seen. Get down here. You'll understand." I sighed, grabbing my tools and slinging them into the bag. It wouldn't be the first time something got snagged in the drill. Most of the time it was loose bits, maybe a scrap from an old mission that went wrong. Sometimes it was nothing more than the drill itself throwing a fit. But Frank wasn't one to exaggerate. The elevator ride down was slow, as always. The mechanical noise buzzed in my ears, the faint rattle of gears reminding me that the system was long overdue for a check. I stared at the walls of the shaft as they slid past, the lights barely illuminating the rough Martian rock outside. It never changed, just the same dry stone stretching down into the depths. When the doors opened, I saw Frank waiting. "Took you long enough?" he muttered, motioning for me to follow him. "What did you hit?" I asked, falling into step behind him. "See for yourself!" He led me to the drill site, and I immediately spotted it. The drill bit was embedded in something shiny. It wasn't rusted or worn like wreckage from an old mission would be. It was smooth, almost as if it had been freshly forged, and yet the layers of rock surrounding it suggested it had been buried here for, hell, I didn't know how long. I knelt down, brushing the dust off the surface of the object with my glove. The drill hadn't damaged it at all. That alone was enough to make me pause. "We thought it was scrap metal at first," Frank said, standing over me. "Then we hit it with the cutter. Nothing. Not a scratch." I glanced up at him. "How deep did you say this was?" "Nearly 2 kilometers down, past where we expected to find anything but rock." I stood up, brushing my gloves. "We need to get this up top, run some tests. Maybe it's some sort of alloy. Something left over from an older mission." Frank didn't respond, just stared at the thing. After a moment, he shook his head. "Yeah, maybe." By the time we got the alloy up to the lab, everyone was talking about it. Word spread fast in a place like this. There wasn't much to do outside of work and the occasional poker game, so anything out of the ordinary became the topic of conversation. Dr. Shepard, the base's chief scientist, was already running his tests when I arrived. The thing sat in the center of the lab, gleaming under the harsh lights. Now that it was out of the ground, I could see it more clearly. It was about the size of a football, though irregularly shaped. The surface was covered in faint ridges that almost looked like writing, though none of it made any sense to me. "What do you think?" I asked, leaning against the counter. Shepard didn't look up from his readings. "Hard to say. Whatever it is, it's not man-made." "Not man-made?" That got my attention. "What do you mean?" He tapped a few keys, bringing up the analysis on the screen. "The alloy doesn't match anything we've synthesized before. It's not from any Earth-origin metal, at least not in this form." "So what? Alien?" He finally glanced at me, the skepticism clear in his expression. "Let's not jump to conclusions. For now, let's just say it's unknown." I frowned, approaching the object. "And what's with the heat? It was cool when we pulled it out, but it's been warming up ever since. Not enough to burn, but still..." "That's what I'm trying to figure out. It's emitting a low-frequency pulse, almost like a signal." "A signal? From what?" Shepard shrugged, turning back to his screen. "That's what I'm trying to find out. For now, I'd advise caution. Until we know more, we should probably limit our exposure to it." The rest of the day passed in routine checks and maintenance tasks. Still, the alloy stayed on my mind. When I passed the other miners in the mess hall, they were already swapping theories. Some thought it was just scrap. Others thought it was something more, an old probe maybe from a forgotten mission. But there was something else, something darker. The way Frank looked at the thing, like it was more than metal. He hadn't been himself since we dug it out. That night, I heard voices in the hallway outside my quarters. Quiet at first, then louder, more agitated. I stepped out, finding Frank and two of the other miners standing outside the lab, arguing. "I'm telling you," Frank said, his voice strained. "I saw something when we pulled that thing out." The others exchanged glances, their skepticism clear. "Saw what exactly?" Frank ran a hand through his hair, his eyes frantic. "It's like... I don't know, a flash maybe. A city or something. Something old, I can't explain it, but it's there, beneath the surface. We shouldn't have touched it." The others laughed, shaking their heads. "You've been out here too long, man. Take a break. Get some sleep." But Frank wasn't laughing. He just stared at the lab door. I watched from the shadows, a knot forming in my gut. Frank was no fool. He wasn't one to lose his head over nothing. But what if he was right? What if we had dug up something we couldn't control? The following day started the same way every day did. System checks, diagnostics, equipment reports. It was all routine, all predictable. I went to the lab first, wanting to check on the alloy. Maybe Shepard had found something new. The door opened, and I stepped inside to find him crouched at his workstation. The alloy sat on the examination table, exactly where we'd left it. But something was different. "Shepard?" I asked, making my way to the table. "Anything new?" He didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed on the screen. His hands were shaking slightly as they hovered above the controls. "Shepard." He looked up then, his face drained of color. "It's spreading." I blinked. "What do you mean, spreading?" He motioned to the screen. "It's emitting more heat, but the signal, it's changing. It's almost like it's broadcasting." "Broadcasting what?" I leaned over his shoulder to look at the data, but it didn't make sense to me. Patterns, numbers, all of it looked random, but Shepard was the scientist here. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's affecting the equipment. We've had power fluctuations across the base all night. The systems are responding to it." "What do you mean, responding?" He opened a secondary monitor displaying a map of the outpost. Red dots blinked in various sections, indicating malfunctions, power surges, and more significant issues in areas like the lower levels, where the drill was housed. "I'm not sure yet. I think it might be messing with the electrical systems." "I didn't like this. I didn't like it one bit." "Have you told anyone else?" "I've tried," Shepard said, rubbing his temples. "But they're not taking it seriously. They think it's just another system hiccup. We're overdue for maintenance in a few areas." It wasn't like Shepard to overreact, and something about the way he spoke felt off. "I'll talk to Frank," I said finally. "He's been on edge since we found this thing." "I'd suggest you move quickly," Shepard said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Whatever this is, it's accelerating." I found Frank in the mess hall, nursing a cup of what passed for coffee out here. There was a far-off look in his eyes as he stared into his cup. He didn't look up when I sat down across from him. "Rough night?" I asked. He shrugged, still not meeting my eyes. "You could say that." "Anything happen after we found that thing?" I prodded. Frank wasn't the type to crack easily, but something about this whole situation had gotten under his skin. He finally looked up. "It's in my head, Marlowe. I can't explain it, but ever since we pulled that thing out, I keep seeing things." "Seeing what?" "Flashes, visions maybe. I can't make sense of it. It's like I'm seeing pieces of something. A city or a place. It's not human, though. It's old." I frowned. "Old?" Frank nodded, his hand shaking slightly as he raised the cup to his lips. "Older than anything we've ever seen. It feels alive." That word hit me hard. Alive? He had to be mistaken. It was just an alloy, a chunk of metal, nothing more. But as I looked at Frank, I couldn't ignore the fear in his eyes. "We need to contain this," I said. "If it's affecting the systems, we have to lock down the base until we know what we're dealing with." Frank just nodded, like he already knew where this was headed. The outpost's lockdown procedures were simple. Designed to keep everything airtight in case of a breach, they involved sectioning off different parts of the base, sealing airlocks, and rerouting power to critical systems only. I oversaw the process myself, working with the other engineers to ensure every step was followed. As we sealed the last section of the base, I passed by Jacobs, one of the other miners. He was staring at the wall, motionless, his face expressionless. I called his name once, then again, louder. He turned slowly, his eyes glassy, like he wasn't fully there. "You all right?" I asked, my voice cautious. Jacobs just blinked at me, his mouth opening slightly as if he was about to say something, but no words came. I stepped closer, waving a hand in front of his face, but he didn't react. Just stared through me like I wasn't there at all. "Jacobs, I'm talking to you!" His head jerked suddenly, snapping back to attention. "Sorry, yeah, I'm fine." He didn't look fine, but I didn't push him further. I couldn't afford to start a panic. "Just get some rest," I muttered, moving past him. Hours later, I heard the first scream. It came from the hallway, piercing and harsh. I grabbed my toolkit and ran toward the source. When I reached the corridor, I saw two men wrestling on the ground. One of them was Frank, his hands around the throat of another miner, a guy named Randy. Randy's face was turning red, his eyes bulging as he tried to claw Frank off of him. Frank's face was twisted, his expression feral. He wasn't the man I'd seen earlier. This was something else, something inhuman. I shouted, running toward them, but he didn't respond. I had to pry him off, using my body weight to shove him back. Randy gasped for air, collapsing to the floor. Frank just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes wild, his hands still twitching like they hadn't finished what they started. "Frank, what the hell is wrong with you?" I snapped, backing away from him. He didn't answer at first, his breath coming in gasps. His hands twitched at his sides, like he was struggling to control them. I saw it again," he muttered, his voice distant. "The city, it's calling me. It wants us to—" I didn't let him finish. "Get to medical. Now." Frank hesitated, then slowly walked away, his steps unsteady. Something was happening to the crew, and it was getting worse. Frank wasn't the first to lose it, but he was the first to get violent. And that scared the hell out of me. We locked down the medical bay that night. Anyone showing signs of aggression or hallucinations was quarantined. But it felt like a losing battle. Every hour, another person reported seeing something, feeling something. The alloy had infected the base in ways none of us understood. After Frank's attack, Shepard suggested that the artifact was too dangerous to remain in the lab. The decision was made quickly. The alloy would be moved to the lower levels and sealed away in the abandoned storage chamber near the drill site. It was the most isolated section of the outpost, away from the critical systems. I oversaw the transport. Shepard, still pale and nervous, gave me a quick rundown of the containment measures he'd set up. A temporary electromagnetic field that would disrupt the pulses, at least for a while. Once it was sealed, we returned to the control room, but nothing felt settled. The base was quieter, but tension clung to the air like the red dust outside. Shepard and I sat in the control room, both of us exhausted, our nerves frayed. "We need to contact Earth," I said, pacing the room. "Tell them what's happening." "They'll take weeks to respond," Shepard muttered, rubbing his temples. "By then we'll either have solved this or what?" I stopped, staring at him. "Or we'll be dead?" Shepard didn't respond. He didn't need to. I looked at the map of the base on the screen, the blinking red dots marking the quarantined sections. The affected areas were growing by the hour. Frank, Jacobs, Randy, they were just the start. Soon we'd be outnumbered by whatever the alloy was turning them into. It didn't take long for the situation to spiral out of control. By the time the second shift started, the outpost had become a pressure cooker, waiting to blow. The remaining crew moved with caution, avoiding eye contact, their steps hurried. Everyone had seen the change in Frank and the others. Everyone was asking the same question. How long until they were next? I was in the control room with Shepard, running system diagnostics again. The base was on full lockdown now, airlocks sealed, unnecessary sections powered down. But even in isolation, things were getting worse. Power surges, communication failures, equipment malfunctions. It was like the alloy had infected the walls of the outpost. "Shepard, how's medical holding up?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the readouts. He looked at his tablet. "Not good. The containment rooms are full. 4 more cases overnight. They're showing the same symptoms: hallucinations, aggression, uncontrollable tremors." "Any word from Earth?" He shook his head. "Nothing yet. Even if we hear back, it won't be soon enough." I cursed. "We're running out of time." Shepard didn't respond. He didn't have to. The screens in front of us told the whole story. Red alerts flashed over half the base now, sections where systems were malfunctioning or people had been quarantined. There was a ripple effect, one failure causing another, like the alloy was reaching out, spreading its influence in every direction. "You said this thing was emitting a signal," I said after a moment. "What kind of signal are we talking about?" Shepard's voice was quiet. "It's not a normal signal. It's not just radio waves or anything we can easily detect. It's something else." I stopped typing, turning to face him. "What do you mean, something else?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's hard to explain. It's like a resonance, but it's affecting more than the equipment. It's affecting people, their brains, their nervous systems. The signal is rewriting them." I frowned. "Rewriting? It's changing the way they think. It starts slow, subtle paranoia, anxiety, but then it escalates. They start seeing things that aren't there, and then, well, you've seen what happens." I stared at the screen and the blinking red lights. "So you're saying this thing is turning them into what? Machines? Monsters?" Shepard didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he didn't want to say it out loud. "It's turning them into something we can't control." I left the control room and headed down the main corridor. It wasn't hard to see the difference now. The way people moved, their expressions tight with fear. The way their hands shook just a little too much when they thought no one was watching. As I reached the medical bay, I noticed 2 of the guards posted outside the door, their hands on their holsters. Both of them looked younger than I remembered, their eyes nervous. They weren't trained for this. Hell, none of us were. But now they were all that stood between us and whatever the alloy was turning the infected into. One of the guards, Harris, gave me a nod as I approached. "You here to see Frank?" "Yeah," I muttered. "How's he doing?" Harris glanced at the other guard, then back at me. "Not good. He's been... well, you'll see." I didn't like the sound of that. Pushing open the door, I stepped inside. Frank sat in one of the containment rooms, separated from the rest of the bay by a thick sheet of reinforced glass. He didn't look like the Frank I knew. His eyes were wild, darting from one side of the room to the other, his hands twitching constantly. When he saw me, he stood up, pressing his hands against the glass. "Marlowe, you have to get me out of here." I held up a hand. "Frank, calm down." He shook his head violently. "No, you don't understand. It's in my head. I can hear it, Marlowe. I can feel it." "What do you feel, Frank?" He pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. "The city. It's calling me. It's alive, Marlowe. It's not a vision. It's real." I didn't know what to say. I'd heard enough of these ramblings from the others to know where this was headed. He wasn't Frank anymore. Not really. "Frank, listen to me. We're trying to figure this out. But you have to stay calm, all right?" He slammed his fist against the glass, making me jump. "No, you don't get it. It's too late. We shouldn't have touched it. We shouldn't have..." His voice cut off as the tremors took over, his body seizing up. He collapsed to the floor, twitching violently. The medical staff rushed in, administering sedatives through the ports in his containment suit. I stood there, watching. This wasn't the first time I'd seen this happen. It wouldn't be the last. That night, I was in the power station when I heard the alarms. I dropped my tools and ran for the central hub. By the time I got there, the scene was chaos. People were shouting, running in every direction. The containment rooms had been breached. Shepard was already there. "The quarantines failed. They're loose." "How many?" I demanded. 5, maybe more." "Where are they?" "They're heading for the lower levels. We have to contain them." Without waiting for further explanation, I grabbed a comms unit and rallied the remaining crew members. We had to move fast. If we didn't stop them before they reached the lower levels, the drill shaft, we'd lose control of the whole base. The lower levels were a maze of tunnels, dark and claustrophobic. I moved with Harris and 2 other crew members, each of us armed with the standard-issue tasers we kept for emergencies. As we approached one of the main junctions, I spotted movement ahead. 3 figures. It was the infected miners. One of them, Jacobs, turned and looked right at me. His face was contorted, his eyes wild. But there was something else. Something wrong with his skin, the veins moving beneath the surface. "Jacobs!" I called out, my voice firm. "Stop right there!" He didn't respond. Instead, he charged towards me. In an instant, he was on me, his hands reaching for my throat. I dodged to the side, slamming the butt of my taser into his ribs. He grunted but didn't stop. His strength was beyond what he should have been capable of. I hit him again, this time in the side of the head, and he collapsed, twitching violently on the ground. The other 2 infected miners turned, their eyes locked on us. Harris fired his taser, hitting one of them in the chest. The miner fell back, convulsing, but the third one, Randy, charged straight for Harris. I moved on instinct, tackling Randy to the ground. He thrashed beneath me, his hands clawing at my face. I shoved him off me, firing the taser into his chest. He screamed, his body jerking as the current surged through him. The aftermath of the breach was worse than we'd expected. 5 infected miners dead, 3 more in quarantine, and the rest of the crew barely holding it together. The power surges continued, and the equipment failures were getting worse. The alloy's influence was spreading faster than we could contain it. I didn't have to say anything. Shepard and I exchanged a glance, and we both knew. It was over. We couldn't stop this, but we weren't going to leave anyone behind. "We need to leave," I muttered. Shepard nodded grimly. "Gather the uninfected. We can't leave them to die here." We moved quickly. The outpost was falling apart, but there was still a handful of people who hadn't yet shown signs of infection, at least not visibly. There were only 6 of them left. They didn't ask questions, just grabbed what they could and followed us to the rover. I loaded the supplies into the back while Shepard helped them climb in. The infected had been sealed in the lower levels, locked behind thick blast doors that would hold, for now. But it wouldn't last. I tried not to think about what would happen once the doors failed. Once everyone was secured, I climbed into the driver's seat and the rover rattled to life. The engines whined under the strain, but they held. We pulled away from the outpost, the dome shrinking behind us as we sped across the Martian landscape toward Outpost 17. No one spoke during the journey. I kept my eyes on the horizon, the endless red dust and rocks stretching out in every direction. Occasionally, I'd glance at the crew in the back. They were silent, their faces tight with fear and exhaustion. I didn't blame them. I felt the same way. The drive to Outpost 17 felt like it took forever. The landscape was endless, the same desolation in every direction. Finally, the domes of Outpost 17 appeared on the horizon. They looked like every other outpost on Mars, but I felt no relief. I kept glancing at the crew, scanning their faces for any sign that the infection had followed us. So far, nothing. We pulled into the airlock and the radio activated. "Rover, this is Outpost 17. You're cleared for entry. Proceed to Bay 3. I glanced at Shepard. He didn't say anything, just nodded. I guided the rover inside and the outer hatch sealed behind us. The crew clambered out, stiff from the journey, but visibly relieved to be inside. 2 guards met us at the door. "We need to speak to your commander," Shepard said, his voice gravelly with exhaustion. The guards exchanged a glance but nodded. "Follow us." We gathered the crew and followed the guards through the winding halls of Outpost 17. The place seemed normal. The lights were stable, the air clear, and people moved with purpose. Nothing like the chaos we'd left behind. We reached the command center, where a man in a grey jumpsuit sat behind a series of monitors. He stood when we entered, extending a hand. "I'm Commander Jeff. I heard you had some trouble at your outpost." "More than trouble," I said, shaking his hand. "The infection spread too fast. We've lost control. We need to report to Mars Central." Jeff frowned and motioned for us to sit. "Tell me everything." I recounted the events, the discovery of the alloy, the power surges, the crew's behavior, and how we managed to seal off the infected miners before fleeing with the remaining uninfected crew. Jeff listened intently, his face tightening with concern as I described the symptoms and the spreading influence of the alloy. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "So you found an artifact? A piece of alloy, you said?" I nodded. "Yes, we sealed it in the lower levels, but it was already too late by then." Jeff let out a long breath. "You're not the first." My heart skipped a beat. "What?" Jeff turned to one of the screens, pulling up an image. The monitor displayed a picture of something that made my stomach drop. It was the artifact, or at least something identical. "We found one couple of days ago, buried deep in our northern sector," Jeff said. "We didn't know what it was either, but shortly after we brought it to the surface, we started experiencing the same things. Power surges, equipment failures, and the crew..." He trailed off, his gaze darkening. "You're saying it's happening here too?" Shepard asked. Jeff nodded. "We've managed to keep it under control for now, but the signals from the alloy are getting stronger, and we've already had a few cases of strange behavior among the crew. We're doing what we can, but..." I stared at the image of the artifact. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "Why didn't you warn us?" Jeff's expression hardened. "What good would it have done? You think Mars Central has a solution for this? They don't. They haven't responded to our reports, and I doubt they ever will. As far as they're concerned, we're on our own." Shepard leaned forward. "So what do we do now?" Jeff didn't answer right away. He looked at the screen again, then back at us. "We try to contain it the best we can, but if it spreads beyond Mars..." He let the thought hang, unfinished. I glanced at the uninfected crew we'd brought with us. They were listening closely, absorbing every word. The infection wasn't just at our outpost. It was here too. We hadn't escaped it. We just walked into the next stage of the nightmare. The red Martian dust swirled outside the observation window, a perpetual storm that never ceased, even when the world within the outpost felt still. I stood there, staring out into the wasteland, my thoughts far from the endless dunes. Days had passed since we'd arrived at Outpost 17, but I wasn't sure I could call this an escape. When we first arrived, we were all put under quarantine. Me, Shepard, the crew we had brought. It didn't matter that we showed no symptoms. Jeff wasn't taking any chances. The isolation wing was cramped. We spent days there, under observation, with nothing to do but wait. But nothing happened. No one exhibited any signs of infection. No hallucinations, no violence, nothing. After a while, the medical team cleared us. They said we were safe, that we hadn't been infected like the others. At the time, it felt like a victory. Maybe we'd escaped it after all. But deep down, I knew better. The alloy wasn't something that left visible scars. Not at first. It burrowed deeper, into your mind, into your thoughts. By the time the symptoms showed, it was already too late. I turned away from the window, unable to look at the swirling dust any longer. I walked down the corridors of Outpost 17, past crew members who carried on with their routines, oblivious to the infection growing beneath their feet. Jeff had promised to keep us informed, but I knew what he wasn't saying. There was no solution. Just containment. As the days wore on, I began to notice it in Shepard too. He stayed mostly silent, keeping to himself, pacing the hallways. He muttered to himself sometimes, though I couldn't make out the words. The look in his eyes had changed, and it scared me. He was hearing it, the same pull that had taken Frank, Randy, and the others back at our outpost. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Shepard, but I could hear it too. I felt it at night, when the outpost was quiet, in the silence just before sleep overtook me. The pull, the city, the one I'd seen in my dreams, the same one Frank had spoken of before he lost himself. Every night it was the same dream. A vast, endless city made of metal, buried deep beneath the Martian surface. I could feel it pulling at me, like invisible strings wrapped around my bones, dragging me closer to something I didn't want to understand. And each night, the pull grew stronger. Later that day, I found Shepard standing at the airlock, staring out at the empty Martian landscape. His hand hovered over the controls, as if he were considering walking out into the dust storm. I didn't stop him. I knew what he was feeling. The same pull that haunted my dreams. "We'll never escape it," he said without turning around. "I know." He let out a long breath, his hand dropping to his side. "There's a city out there," he murmured, "beneath the surface. It's calling us. It's been calling us from the moment we touched that artifact." I came up, standing next to him. The airlock window revealed nothing but endless dust and rock. But I knew what he meant. The artifact wasn't a piece of metal. It was a beacon, and we had answered its call. The infection wasn't something that could be fought or contained. It was something ancient, something older than Mars, older than any human understanding. And it was waking up. The weeks turned into months. The infection spread through Outpost 17, just as it had at our base. There were fewer and fewer uninfected now. I watched as the crew fell, one by one, drawn into the same madness that had claimed the others. Shepard disappeared one night, and I never saw him again. Maybe he had finally answered the call, walking out into the wasteland to find the city that haunted our dreams. Mars Central stopped responding to our reports weeks ago. Outpost 17 had gone dark, just like our base had. No one was coming. No one was going to save us. I sat alone in the command center, staring at the blank screens. It was peaceful, in a way, the quiet before the end. As I closed my eyes, I felt the city calling to me again, stronger now. The call matched the rhythm of my heartbeat, and I knew I wouldn't resist much longer. Mars belonged to it now, and soon so would I.